Good evening. On this channel, I tell the stories of real samurai who lived during Japan's Sengoku period. Every person who appears here truly existed. These stories were originally created in Japanese for a Japanese audience. However, Japanese history contains many terms, ideas, and values that are difficult to understand through direct translation alone. Because of this, YouTube's automatic translation often fails to convey the true meaning to non-Japanese viewers. For this reason, this video has been carefully re-edited and rewritten with historical terms and cultural concepts explained in ways that are easier to understand for an international audience. Tonight's story is about Oda Nobunaga, one of the most influential figures of the Sengoku period. He was a man who shattered old traditions, upearned the balance of power, and set Japan on a path toward unification. If there are any parts that remain unclear, please let me know in the comments. Your feedback will help improve future videos. Through these stories, I hope you can gain a deeper understanding of what a samurai truly was.
June 2nd, 1582. It was the height of the rainy season, and Kyoto was wrapped in the heavy, humid air of the early morning. It must have been just past 4 a.m. The sky before dawn was still dark, and the city was sunk deep in sleep. Honnoji Temple, located in a corner of the capital, was also dominated by silence. Within the temple grounds, the lingering atmosphere of a tea gathering held the previous night might have still been present. Exquisite tea utensils and carefully selected masterpieces lay in wait. Together with their master, Oda Nobunaga, they were stealing a brief moment of rest. His long-cherished ambition of Tenkafubu, unifying the entire realm under military rule, was just one step away from completion. The enemies remaining in the west and east were few, and the long era of warring states was about to be ended by Nobunaga's hand. He was 49 years old. For a man who often recited the verse that a human life lasts only 50 years, the stillness of this night may have been his final piece before facing the sum of his life. But that silence was broken suddenly, and violently. At first, it was a dull sound, like the wind or perhaps distant thunder. But the noise gradually multiplied, turning into a rumble that shook the ground. The sound of hooves, the metallic grating of armor, and the presence of countless men holding their breath. A quarrel? When Nobunaga woke in his bedchamber, he initially thought the commotion was a fight among the servants. In those days, it was not uncommon for small skirmishes to occur around the temple. Perhaps it was the composure of a ruler, or perhaps he simply could not imagine an enemy invading this place. Nobunaga's reaction was calm. However, a sharp bursting sound told him that his assumption was wrong. But a dry, cracking noise. It was gunfire. Not just one shot, but a continuous roar of muskets. Furthermore, an angry roar of "Charge!" echoed through the silent temple grounds. It was not a mob or a band of bandits surrounding the temple. It was a perfectly disciplined regular army. The gates of Honnoji were smashed open, and armed soldiers flooded in. Nobunaga's young page, Mori Ranmaru, rushed through the corridor, hurrying to his lord's side. "My lord, it is treason!" Ranmaru's voice trembled with tension. Nobunaga stood up in his sleeping robes, his sharp eyes flashing. "Whose men are they?" A force capable of leading such a large army into the heart of Kyoto without being noticed. Did such a power even exist in Japan at that time? The answer Ranmaru gave struck at the blind spot of Nobunaga's thinking. "The banner bears the light blue bellflower." At that moment, a man's face floated in Nobunaga's mind, a man who was deeply cultured, polite, and who valued the discipline of the Oda clan more than anyone else. The sharpest mind in the household, the General Nobunaga evaluated most highly and entrusted with the harshest missions. "Akechi!" What leaked from Nobunaga's lips was a low mutter, neither surprise nor acceptance. "Akechi Mitsuhide, Why him? Why now? History does not possess many words to describe the emotions that came and went in Nobunaga's chest. Just one phrase. Nobunaga declared, "There is no help for it," meaning it cannot be helped, or this is no time to argue right or wrong, or perhaps this too is fate. Into these short words, open to various interpretations, Nobunaga poured everything. He immediately took up a bow and began to loose arrows at the approaching soldiers. Nobunaga's martial arts were by no means just for show. He shot down enemies one after another, but he was heavily outnumbered. Eventually, the string of his bow snapped, and he switched to a spear to fight, but the number of enemies did not decrease. Instead, they only increased. The murderous soldiers of Akechi rushed toward the main hall like beasts swarming their prey. Receiving a spear wound to his elbow and realizing this was the end, Nobunaga ordered the court ladies to flee. He would die here, but the women must survive. Was this the final mercy shown by the man called the cruel Demon King? Or was it his aesthetic sense, not wanting anyone to see the manner of his death? Nobunaga disappeared deep into the temple, into a storage room. He locked it from the inside and set fire to it himself. The crimson flames licked up the sliding doors, the pillars, and the ceiling in the blink of an eye. Heat and smoke filled the air, dyeing his vision red. What was Nobunaga thinking within that hellfire? The colossal dream of national unification. That dream was shattered just before completion by the hand of his most trusted subordinate. Betrayal. Although common in the Warring States period, it was too dramatic, too inexplicable a curtain call. Nobunaga's body was consumed by the flames and was never found. It was as if his very existence had been an illusion, or perhaps as if the heavens had refused to keep him on Earth. The Honnoji incident. This was not merely a coup d'état. It is the greatest mystery in Japanese history. Here, a question arises. How was the man named Oda Nobunaga able to climb this high? And why, at the peak of his power, was he stabbed in the back so defenselessly? Did Mitsuhide kill his lord simply out of a grudge? Or did he harbor some definitive fear of the future Nobunaga was creating? The key to solving that mystery is hidden in a place 48 years prior to this day of flames, in Owari Province. When Nobunaga was still called by his childhood name, Kipposhi. No, the answer must lie in the origin point, where he was called a fool, understood by no one, starting his lonely battle. Nobunaga's life was a succession of fighting and destruction. However, what he really wanted to destroy was not just enemy castles or armies. It was old customs, authority, common sense, and the fear that nests in the human heart. The 49 years he raced through were like intense labor pains for the country of Japan to be reborn from the Middle Ages into the early modern era. As Nobunaga's consciousness faded in the burning Honnoji temple, memories raced through his mind like a revolving lantern. Was it the day he threw incense at his father's funeral? The day he shouted in the thunderstorm at the Battle of Okeazama? Or the weight of the musket when he held one for the first time? Now, let us wind back the clock of the story. The color of the flames turns from red to the brilliant colors of the morning glow. The smell of smoke changes to the scent of young grass. There stands a single boy whom no one knows yet. An innocent and cruel boy who makes the world his enemy, and yet still laughs. Time returns to the year 1534. In Shibata Castle, located in the west of present-day Aichi Prefecture in Owari Province, a baby boy gave his first cry. His childhood name was Kipposhi. This was the future Oda Nobunaga. The land of Owari, where Nobunaga was born and raised, was bustling with commerce and had a spirit that favored new things. However, even in the eyes of the people of Owari, the boy Nobunaga was too bizarre. He betrayed every expectation of behavior for the eldest son of a samurai family. The clothes he wore were like a casual summer robe with the sleeves rolled up. He hung a flint bag and a gourd from his waist, and his hair was tied up strangely like a tea whisk. To top it off, he wore flashy half-trousers made of tiger or leopard skin. He looked like a kabuki mono, an eccentric person who dresses to shock and defy social norms. Walking through the castle town, Nobunaga would always be chewing on persimmons or melons, walking arm in arm with young men of low status. Seeing their lord's figure, the retainers whispered in the shadows. "That is a fool, Utsuke," they said. Utsuke meant empty or an idiot. What about his father, Nobuhide, the fierce general known as the Tiger of Owari, and feared by neighboring provinces, silently permitted his son's eccentricities? It is said he sometimes leaked the thought, "Perhaps that fool has some idea," but no one knew his true intent. However, as long as the breakwater of his great father existed, Nobunaga was protected. The time for that breakwater to collapse came. In 1551, his father, Nobuhide, died suddenly of an epidemic disease. He was 42. With the fall of the giant tree that supported the backbone of the Oda family, a massive shockwave ran through Owari province. The funeral was held grandly at Banshoji Temple in Nagoya. As key retainers attended and a solemn atmosphere flowed, the chief mourner, Nobunaga, appeared. The attendees doubted their eyes at his appearance. His hair was in a messy tea-whisk topknot. He wore no formal trousers, and he was dressed strangely with just a long sword and a short sword wrapped in rough rope. Nobunaga stomped loudly up to the altar and did not even pinch the incense to pray quietly. He grabbed a handful of the powdered incense and threw it violently at his father's mortuary tablet. A thud echoed through the hall. As the powder scattered, Nobunaga walked away into the back without looking at anyone. What a punishment he deserves. He is a genuine fool after all. The retainers' disappointment turned into anger. In contrast, his younger brother Nobukatsu, dressed formally and politely, mourning his father with tears. Seeing this, the members of the household decided in their hearts that the next head of the family should be the younger brother. This incident also triggered the loss of the person who understood Nobunaga best, Hiya Masahide, his appointed guardian and tutor. The old retainer who had protected and educated Nobunaga since childhood felt responsible for being unable to stop his lord's eccentric behavior and took his own life by committing seppuku ritual suicide. "My lord, please become a proper samurai." That was the final admonition the old man demonstrated with his death. Even Nobunaga was devastated by this. He built a temple for Masahide to pray for the repose of his soul, but the lost trust would not return. His father died, his old guardian died, and Nobunaga was completely isolated. From this moment, a terrifying gear began to turn within the Oda family. His own relatives began to harbor a reason to kill Nobunaga. From here, the story plunges into a blood-washed struggle for succession. The inside of one's home is the most frightening place. Nobunaga's first battlefield was neither Okehazama nor Mino. It was the very Oda clan where he was born and raised. Hayashi Hidesada, the top-ranking retainer of the Oda clan, and Shibata Katsui, renowned as a fierce general, openly began movements to support the younger brother Nobukatsu. Even more painfully, his own mother, Doda Gozen, shunned Nobunaga and doted on his brother. Mother, brother, retainers, all were enemies. The gaze directed at the 18-year-old family head, Nobunaga, was cold and filled with murderous intent. Normally, one would break under such pressure or hand over the headship to the brother and retire. But Nobunaga was different. In this situation of isolation and helplessness, he began a cold, hard calculation. "If you try to kill me, I will kill you back." Under the mask of the fool, Nobunaga bared his sharp fangs for the first time. He distanced himself from the untrustworthy veteran retainers and began to employ young men of low status or second and third sons to be his hands and feet. Among them were Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Mayatoshi, who would later become famous figures. Then Nobunaga took surprising action. Knowing that the head retainers of his brother's faction, Hayashi Hidesada and Shibata Katsuie, were plotting treason, he dared to let them be. He waited patiently for the moment the traitors revealed their tales. The situation in Owari, centered around Kiyosu Castle, was wrapped in tension on the verge of explosion. In 1556, the time finally came. His brother Nobukatsu raised an army to kill Nobunaga. This was the beginning of the, quote, Battle of Ino. The enemy outnumbered Nobunaga's forces by more than 2 to 1. Moreover, the opponents were the elites of the Oda clan. However, the figure of Nobunaga commanding on the battlefield bore no trace of the fool. He shouted loudly and charged into the enemy lines himself at the forefront. "Charge! I will cut down anyone who retreats." His demonic intensity made the enemy army led by Shibata Katsuie flinch. The result was an overwhelming victory for Nobunaga. He forced the fierce general Shibata Katsuie to surrender and cornered his brother, Nobukatsu. At this time, due to the tearful pleading of his mother, Dota Gozen, Nobunaga forgave his brother just once. There will be no next time, he told him, but this mercy would give birth to further tragedy. Nobunaga learned a lesson. Sweetness invites death. Nobukatsu, who was supposed to be forgiven, did not learn his lesson and plotted treason again. His mother's tears would no longer work. Nobunaga feigned illness to lure Nobukatsu to the castle, and without any hesitation, took his life. He buried his own brother with his own hands. The poison inside the house must be completely drained. Nobunaga did not kill the rebellious Shibata Katsuie, but conversely forgave and employed him heavily. He calculated that an opponent who had been defeated and forced to submit once would not betray him. This rationality and ruthlessness. The laughingstock Kippashi had, before anyone realized it, transformed into a commander no one could defy. Before fighting external enemies, Nobunaga first cleared his path with the heads of his allies. May 1560. The sky of Owari was covered with heavy, damp clouds. It was as if foreshadowing the death approaching this country. Express messengers rushed into Kiyosu Castle one after another from the forts guarding the border. Every report brought was despairing. Imagawa Yoshimoto's army has entered Kutsukake Castle. The vanguard is Matsudaira Motoyasu, the later Tokugawa Ieyasu. He has succeeded in delivering provisions to Odaka Castle. The main force, led by Imagawa Yoshimoto, the ruler of the Tokaido region, numbered approximately 25,000. In contrast, the military strength the Oda family could mobilize, no matter how much they scraped together, did not reach 4,000. The difference in military power was roughly 6 to 10 times. This was not merely a hard fight. Physically, there was no chance of winning. It was like a massive tsunami rushing toward a small breakwater. The people of Owari and the soldiers alike were all convinced of the Oda clan's destruction. The man named Imagawa Yoshimoto was not merely a weak general affecting courtly heirs. He was a top-class politician and strategist who perfectly governed the 3 provinces of Suruga, Totomi, and Mikawa, establishing laws and enriching the economy. His nickname, the greatest archer in the Tokaido, was not for show. Yoshimoto had made perfect preparations and finally launched his army to march to Kyoto. His invasion route was calculated meticulously. He crushed the Oda side's forts one by one, secured supply lines, and slowly tightened the noose around Nobunaga's neck. A perfect formation with no gap for even an ant to escape. In the Great Hall of Kiyosu Castle, heavy retainers engaged in heated debates day and night, but those discussions were painted over with fear. "We should hole up in the castle and seek a path for peace," shouted the head retainer Hayashi Hidesada. "No, we must intercept them in a field battle, strike a blow, and die with the honor of a samurai." the fierce General Shibata Katsui slammed the desk. Surrender or honorable suicide. Either choice meant death. The head of the family, Nobunaga, sitting in the seat of honor, just listened silently to the sorrowful cries of his retainers. His expression did not move, like a no mask, and his eyes were looking somewhere far away, into the void. Nobunaga's attitude at the war council seemed too lethargic. "My lord, what do you intend to do?" Even at the retainer's question, Nobunaga stifled a yawn and answered shortly, "It is late. You should all withdraw and sleep." Throwing out these words, Nobunaga disappeared into his inner sleeping quarters. The retainers left behind fell to their knees in despair. It is over. The Lord's spirit was broken before the fight even began. As expected, a fool cannot shoulder this national crisis. A heavy sense of defeat began to drift through the castle. Soldiers fleeing one after another were endless. But had Nobunaga really given up? No, he had not. In his lonely bedchamber, he was repeating simulations until his brain almost burned out. Against an army of 25,000, a direct clash meant 100% defeat. Holing up in the castle meant only being starved to death, since there was no hope for reinforcements. The path to victory existed only in a single point, narrower than the eye of a needle. That was to aim only for the head of the supreme commander, Imagawa Yoshimoto. A large army is like a giant snake. If it loses its head, it will writhe and destroy itself. But how? Yoshimoto was right in the middle of 25,000 soldiers. Approaching the heavily guarded main camp was impossible. Nobunaga needed two conditions. One was the moment when the enemy, absolutely convinced of victory, let their guard down, dispersed their forces, and loosened their formation. The other was a curtain of heaven to hide his figure to approach at that moment. He kept waiting for information. He had released shinobi, ninjas, and scouts, obsessively probing the movements of the Imagawa army and the condition of the sky. Before dawn on the fateful day of May 19th, decisive information was brought to Kiyosu Castle. Imagawa Yoshimoto is resting at Mount Okehazama. Furthermore, the air became damp and the wind changed. Nobunaga's skin sensed a slight change in atmospheric pressure. It is coming. A storm is coming. Nobunaga sprang up. His clear voice resonated through the still dark great hall. "Bring the asterisk, Atsumori." As pages hurriedly prepared a hand drum, Nobunaga stood up with a folding fan in his hand. In the tense atmosphere, he danced. It was a dance filled with a demonic spirit, less like a ritual for departure and more like tuning his own soul to the other world. Human life lasts only 50 years. Compared to the time in Getten, the lower heavens, it is but a dream and an illusion. His voice was resonant. A human life is nothing more than a fleeting dream compared to the flow of time in the celestial world. If so, what is there to fear? What is there to lose? My 26 years of life were all for this moment. Once life is given, is there anyone who does not perish? As soon as he finished dancing, Nobunaga threw away the fan. "Blow the conch shell, give me my armor!" Standing up, he shoveled asterisk yuzuke, rice with hot water, into his mouth and smashed the bowl onto the floor. Crash! The sound of breaking pottery shattered the silence of Kiyosu Castle. "We move out!" Nobunaga flew out of the castle with only 5 attendants. It was a mad dash that did not even wait for the main unit to prepare. "Do not let the Lord die!" "Follow him. Do not fall behind." Panicked retainers ran after him one by one. Iwamuro Shigeyasu, Hasegawa Kyosuke, Sasa Narimasa, Maeda Toshie. A scattered line of horsemen. It was too disorderly to be called an army. like a pack of hunting dogs chasing prey. Nobunaga headed for Atsuta Shrine. While ostensibly to pray for victory, his true purpose lay elsewhere. To buy time and wait for the scattered soldiers to gather, and above all, to wait for the weather to change. When Nobunaga offered his prayers at the front of Atsuta Shrine, a strange thing happened. The trees, which had been quiet until then, began to rustle, and a gust of wind sprang up. The sky was rapidly covered by black clouds. Pitter-patter, large drops of rain began to hit the ground. The retainers whispered, "It is a divine wind." But only Nobunaga looked up at the sky with cold eyes. It is not God. It is probability. Nobunaga knew the terrain and the weather inside out. This season, this wind direction, this humidity. He was certain it would turn into a downpour that would steal one's vision. Because he had that conviction, he chose this timing. All right, just the soldiers who have gathered are enough. Let's go. By the time they left Atsuta Shrine, the Oda army had swelled to about 2,000 men. Their destination was Okehazama. It was a terrain of intricate small hills and wetlands, suitable for an army to rest, but if ambushed, it became a trap like a rat in a bag with no escape. Imagawa Yoshimoto, convinced of his victory, must have been leisurely eating his lunch there. The Oda army entered the Zenshoji fort and observed the enemy's movements from there. That was when it happened. The heavens finally sided with Nobunaga. Thunder roared, and a torrential rain like overturned buckets began to pour down. Visibility turned completely white, making it impossible to see even an inch ahead. The intense sound of rain drowned out all other noises. The footsteps of thousands of moving soldiers, the rustling of armor, the rain hid them all. Now, without even trying to wipe his wet face, Nobunaga shouted orders to the entire army. The enemy is Imagawa Yoshimoto. His head is the only one we want. I need no extra heads. Do not waste time on common soldiers. Charge straight into the main camp without looking aside. This order signified a, quote, suicide attack with no retreat. There was no longer any fear in the soldiers' eyes. A tremendous murderous intent and a conviction-like frenzy rose from Nobunaga's back. As if infected by it, the 2,000 soldiers became a single solid mass. In the rain, the Oda army took a detour route and circled behind the Imagawa main camp. Looking down from the cliff, they could see the Imagawa camp curtains in the valley. To avoid the rain, the soldiers were huddled together, weapons set aside, completely off guard. Charge! In the gap of silence, the moment the thunder stopped, Nobunaga's spirited cry tore through the damp air. It was less a command and more the roar of a beast biting into its prey. Under the cover of the rain's noise, the Oda soldiers who had closed in to within just a few meters behind the Imagawa main camp rose all at once from the mud. With a rumble like the earth shaking, a black mass crashed into the Imagawa army. "Enemy attack! Enemy attack!" The screams of the sentries were instantly drowned out by angry roars and the sound of clashing metal. The Imagawa soldiers were caught completely off guard. For men who had been sharing sake and drying their wet armor, this assault was nothing short of a nightmare. What is it? A quarrel. In the center of the main camp, inside a luxurious vermilion-lacquered palanquin, Imagawa Yoshimoto raised his voice in displeasure. He never dreamed that the Oda army had come this far. He assumed the lower-ranking men were drunk and causing a ruckus. Dismissing it as such, he opened the door of the palanquin a crack. What jumped into his eyes was a scene from hell. Soldiers, deformed by being soaked in blood, were skewering his retainers one after another with spears, and at the lead, a single man swinging a long sword with the face of a demon. Oda Nobunaga. Their eyes met. Nobunaga's pupils harbored a cold, dark light, devoid of human emotion. "Is that Yoshimoto there?" As Nobunaga shouted, several members of his elite guard rushed toward the palanquin. "Damn you, mere country lord!" Beneath his thick court noble makeup, Yoshimoto revealed his fighting spirit as a warrior. He kicked the palanquin open, leaped out, and drew his family heirloom sword, the Matsukura-go. The man called the greatest archer in the Tokaido was not just a weak decoration. Yoshimoto's swordsmanship was sharp, brilliantly parrying the first strike of the attacking Oda soldiers. One flash, then another. 2 Oda soldiers collapsed from the knees. However, this was a battlefield of mud. On a slope with poor footing, in a chaotic melee against overwhelming numbers, individual bravery was equal to powerlessness. First spear, Hattori Kohita. One of Nobunaga's mounted guards threw himself at Yoshimoto in a desperate tackle. Yoshimoto knocked the spear down and slashed Kohita's knee, but his posture was broken. Into that opening, another man crept up like a shadow. It was Mori Shinsuke. "Prepare yourself." Shinsuke tackled the toppling Yoshimoto's torso, pushing him straight down into the mud. Muddy water splashed as the 2 bodies became a ball, rolling around. Summoning his last ounce of strength, Yoshimoto caught Shinsuke's left index finger in his mouth and bit down hard enough to sever it. The sound of bone cracking echoed. Though grimacing in agony, Shinsuke held his short sword in a reverse grip and pressed it against Yoshimoto's neck. "Urgh, regret," thud. With a sensation of warmth, Imagawa Yoshimoto's movements stopped. It was the moment the giant elephant finally expired. Imagawa Yoshimoto, taken! Mori Shinsuke held the mud-covered head of Yoshimoto high. His voice echoed through the valley after the rain, completely changing the atmosphere of the battlefield. Having lost their supreme commander, the Imagawa army was no longer an army. They became a mere fleeing crowd, scattering like baby spiders in a rout. "We won! We really won!" The Oda soldiers stood frozen with expressions of disbelief. The black clouds covering the sky departed, and the setting sun shone through. Its red light illuminated the battlefield covered in blood and mud. Normally, an explosive victory cry would rise here. However, strangely enough, what dominated the place was silence. The soldiers' gazes were poured onto a single point. It was the figure of Nobunaga on horseback, staring down at Yoshimoto's head. He was not laughing. He was not excited. He was merely confirming the corpse, professionally and dispassionately. Seeing his profile, the retainers, especially the veteran heavy retainers like Shibata Katsui and Hayashi Hidesada, felt something cold run down their spines. Did this man see that it would turn out like this from the beginning? The suicidal act of charging into an enemy 10 times their size. What if, for Nobunaga, that was nothing more than the answer to a calculated formula? Wrap the head. We return to Kiyosu. Nobunaga's first words were far too quiet. There was no basking in the afterglow of victory, nor words to thank the soldiers. He turned his reins and began to walk without looking back. Seeing his retreating figure, the retainers felt a bottomless fear that surpassed awe. What if he had lost this gamble? We would have all died in vain. The lord, named Nobunaga, possesses a madness that allows him to calmly bet everyone's lives, including his own, as chips for his purpose. Perhaps that madness simply happened to bear fruit this time, in the form of a miracle. Despite the victory, the Oda army's return path was as silent as a funeral procession. What awaited Nobunaga upon his triumphant return to Kiyosu Castle was a fervent welcome. The Lord did it! He took the head of the great thief of the realm! The people of the domain were jubilant, worshipping Nobunaga like a god. However, Nobunaga's own heart was rapidly cooling. He had realized it, that miracles do not happen twice. Nobunaga, drinking sake alone in the great hall with Yoshimoto's head placed before him, suddenly noticed the trembling of his own hand. It was not trembling from excitement. It was the intense exhaustion known only to those who have crossed the line of death and a premonition of the hell to come. I won. This victory would plant excessive expectations in those around him. Mingokte tuanid days. He will do something even more amazing next time. Nobunaga will manage somehow. Those very expectations would become the chains that bound Nobunaga. If I lose next time, it is the end. Okehazama was not the goal. It was the entrance to the endless path of Shura, a realm of carnage. Nobunaga gripped his sake cup with enough force to crush it and glared into the darkness. In the direction of his gaze, the north was reflected. Mino, the cursed country left behind by Saito Dosan. Next time, I cannot rely on trickery. Nobunaga killed the fool within himself. The gambler is finished. From now on, I must be more precise than anyone, more cruel than anyone, and more rational than anyone. I must build an army that wins, because it is destined to win. On the night of Okehazama, Nobunaga shed his skin and became the Demon King. The stage of the story moves from here to the conquest of Mino. However, that was not a spectacular battle like Okehazama. It was the beginning of a muddy war of attrition lasting 7 years, and days of hardship that would fundamentally change Nobunaga's personality. At the center of that battle, the shadows of two people were always present. One was his late father-in-law, Saito Dosan, and the other was his daughter, Nobunaga's wife, Nohime. A few days passed since the frenzy of Okehazama. Deep inside Kiyosu Castle, in the dim light of a paper lantern, was Nobunaga. A map was spread out before him, the road heading north. Lying there was the giant water dragon called the Kiso River, and beyond it, steep mountains stretched out. Mino. This province, located in the southern part of present-day Gifu Prefecture, was not merely a neighboring country to Nobunaga. The sliding door opened quietly, and a woman entered. Nobunaga's official wife, Nohime. "Can you not sleep, my lord?" Her voice contained a dignified ring mixed with a somewhat deep sorrow. She was the daughter of the former lord of Mino, Saito Dosan, who was called the Viper. For Nobunaga, attacking Mino meant burning his wife's hometown and killing his wife's relatives. Hicho, Nobunaga called Nohime by her childhood name. "Do you remember the words your father, Lord Dosan, said to me?" Nohime nodded silently. Once, during a meeting at Shotokuji Temple, Dosan saw through Nobunaga's talent and prophesied, "My children will eventually tie their horses at Nobunaga's gate, become his servants." But reality was different. Dosan was killed by his own son Yoshitatsu, and Mino was now ruled by those who had betrayed Dosan. "I will receive Mino, just as my father-in-law stated in his will." At Nobunaga's words, Nohime smiled faintly. "My father would desire that. Those spineless men cannot protect the people of Mino." She took a short sword from her robe and placed it on the tatami mat. It was the dagger Dosan had given her upon her marriage, saying, "If Nobunaga is a fool, stab him to death with this." "This blade is no longer meant for you, my lord. Please turn it toward those who block your path." It was her resolve as a wife and as the daughter of the Viper. Nobunaga picked up the dagger and cast off the sheath. In the cold shine of the metal, he felt as if he saw Dosan's laughing face. "Let's go! We will devour Mino entirely." 1561. Nobunaga began his full-scale conquest of Mino. However, unimaginable hardship awaited him. The surprise attack he showed at Okehazama would not work a second time. The soldiers of Mino were strong and knew the terrain inside out. And above all, their base, Inabayama Castle, was an impregnable fortress, towering atop the summit of Mount Kinka. "Attack! Cross the river!" Nobunaga sent armies repeatedly, but each time they were blocked by the Kiso River's rapid current and a fierce rain of arrows from the opposite bank. Days continued where the water surface was dyed red with Oda blood. "My lord, further brute force is impossible. The soldiers cannot hold out." Even fierce generals, like Shibata Katsui, began to complain about Mino's solid defense. He could not win. The man who performed a miracle at Okehazama was caught in the quagmire of Mino, unable to move. Impatience, irritation, and a complex regarding the giant phantom of Dosan. What would Lord Dosan do? Nobunaga repeated this question to himself. That cold-hearted viper would never foolishly attack honestly from the front. One night, Nobunaga decided to change tactics. It meant discarding the quote, battle of a samurai. From tomorrow, there is no need to fight enemy soldiers, Nobunaga declared coldly to his puzzled retainers. Burn the fields, raid the villages, starve the people of Mino. It was a scorched earth policy. From the next day, there was not a day when black smoke did not rise over the Mino sky. Burning rice before harvest, burying wells, destroying bridges. Not chipping away at enemy forces, but destroying their very livelihood and stealing their will to live. It was not the battle of a hero, but the work of a demon. They are ogres. The Oda are ogres. The people of Mino fled in confusion and cursed Nobunaga. However, Nobunaga's heart did not ache. Or perhaps he had numbed the pain. He was projecting himself onto the mirror of Dosan. Discard sweetness. To be a ruler is to sip even muddy water for the objective. A monster named rationality began to grow within Nobunaga. To win, choose any means. That coldness would soon terrify not only enemies, but allies as well. Do not take the castle. Take their hearts. Along with the starvation tactics, Nobunaga began insidious, subversive activities. He kept sending secret letters to powerful generals in Mino. Does your current lord, Saito Tatsuki, have a future? Join the Oda, and I will double your territory. Or threats. If you do not betray, I will massacre your entire clan. Paranoia. What Nobunaga sowed in Mino was not gunpowder, but the poison of mistrust. A friend from yesterday might betray you today. Cracks slowly but surely appeared in Mino's solid unity. Nobunaga continued this mind-numbing war of nerves for years. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Days of endless, dull cruelty, unlike the single night of Okehazama. During that time, Nobunaga built a new castle at Komakiyama and moved his base there. This was a statement of intent to keep a blade at Mino's throat, not from deep within Owari. Nobunaga will not give up. That persistence cornered the Mino generals like a body blow, and within this long, painful struggle, Nobunaga took notice of one man's unique ability. A man of low status, but with the wisdom of a monkey. Kinoshita Tokichiro, later Toyotomi Hideyoshi. My lord, we cannot win a head-on fight. Let me use a little wisdom. Tokichiro proposed an unconventional plan. To build a fort overnight at Tsunomata, the confluence of rivers right in front of the enemy. A castle has sprung up at Tsunomata. The soldiers of Mino lost their nerve seeing the fort floating in the morning mist. In reality, it was a hasty construction made by transporting pre-cut lumber on rafts from upstream and assembling fences and towers overnight. However, the psychological effect was immense. The Oda have a monkey who uses magic. Fear spread, and the morale of the Mino army collapsed. This Tsunomata incident was a major discovery for Nobunaga as well. Lineage and bloodlines served no purpose. Seeing Tokichiro working covered in mud, Nobunaga became convinced. Only the ability to produce results matters. This thorough meritocracy transformed the Oda army into a rational and ferocious organization, different from other daimyo armies bound by old customs. And in August 1567, the time finally came. The seeds of subversion Nobunaga had sown for years sprouted all at once. The key to Mino's defense, the heavy retainers known as the West Mino Triumvirate, made their move. Inaba Itetsu, Ando Morinari, and Uji Bokuzen. They abandoned their lord, the Saito family, and promised to communicate with Nobunaga. "We will throw open the castle gates." Betrayal. It was a far crueler and more certain key to victory than a frontal breakthrough. When Nobunaga's main force advanced to Inabayama Castle, the intense rain of arrows no longer fell. Yesterday's enemies welcomed them waving Oda flags. The mountain castle that boasted impregnability collapsed as if rotting from the inside out. The castle lord, Saito Tatsuoki, fled down the Nagara River in a small boat, still in his pajamas, escaping to Ise. The country of Mino, which the former viper, Saito Dosan, had built in a single generation, fell into Nobunaga's hands with disappointing silence. The sound of conch shells announcing the end of the battle echoed through the valleys of Mount Kinka. Nobunaga climbed to the top floor of the castle without even wiping his bloody sword. Below him spread the majestic Nobi Plain, the view from which his father-in-law Dosan once dreamed of the realm. "Father-in-law, can you see this?" Nobunaga gripped the railing tightly and spoke to the late Dosan. "I have devoured this country that you loved, that you stole, and that killed you." At this moment, the last residue of the Fool of Owari vanished completely from Nobunaga. He was no longer a provincial rebel. He was born as a new ruler who had overcome and swallowed the giant mirror that was Dosan. Nobunaga decided to give a new name to this castle and town. Throw away the rustic name Inokuchi. From today, this place is Gifu. Gifu. The name derives from Quoquishan, the mountain where King Wen of Zhou in ancient China established his foothold for unifying the realm. The retainers gasped. The Lord does not consider Mino the goal. He intends to flatten the entire realm starting from here. Then, Nobunaga began using a seal, Tenkafubu, to command the realm with military power. Until then, the goal of warlords was to protect their territory and continue their family line. But what Nobunaga raised was the outrageous ambition of changing the very shape of the country of Japan. The moment he left Mino, Nobunaga touched the disease called Tenka, the realm, a sickness from which one can never escape once possessed. Next is Kyoto. In the Great Hall of Gifu Castle, Nobunaga pointed to the west side of the map. To command the realm, he must go up to Kyoto and obtain the authority of the emperor and the shogun. However, if an outsider suddenly marched an army into Kyoto, they would just be an invader. Nobunaga needed a signboard of justice. He needed the imperial brocade banner, a symbol of the emperor's absolute authority that would silence any opposition. At that moment, as if fate had arranged it, a messenger from a certain man visited Nobunaga, Ashikaga Yoshiaki. He was the younger brother of the former Muromachi shogun, a wandering noble, who had been chased from Kyoto after losing a political struggle and was roaming the lands. He was looking for a powerful daimyo to take him back to Kyoto and install him as shogun. "Lord Nobunaga, will you not grant my wish?" Reading Yoshiaki's letter, Nobunaga twisted his lip and smiled. Usable, Yoshiaki had neither soldiers nor money. All he had was the moldy brand of the Ashikaga shogunate family. But for Nobunaga, that brand was the pass he wanted more than anything. "We will support Lord Yoshiaki, march to the capital, and restore the shogunate." There was no greater just cause. Nobunaga immediately wrote a reply and invited Yoshiaki to Gifu. Yoshiaki wept with joy. "Nobunaga, you are the most loyal of retainers." However, he did not realize. He had not tamed a tiger, he was merely the bait placed on the tiger's back. September 1568. Oda Nobunaga hoisted Ashikaga Yoshiaki as his figurehead, using the shogun like a symbolic puppet to legitimize his cause, and departed Gifu leading an unprecedented army of 60,000. The march to the capital began. However, this march was not merely a military action. Nobunaga broadcast a powerful message to all of Japan. Anyone who steals even a single coin will be beheaded immediately. Nobunaga imposed abnormally strict discipline on his army. By the common sense of the time, looting by soldiers was a right acting as a quote-quote-quote for salary, but Nobunaga forbade it entirely. Steal a single blade of grass or a chicken from a house, and heads would roll on the spot. The orderly march of the massive Oda army. The people along the road were dumbfounded by the beautiful yet terrifying sight. This army is different from the bandit-like samurai of the past. Is this the ruler of the new era? Not fear, but awe. By showing order rather than violence, Nobunaga dominated people's hearts without fighting. October 1568. Just half a month after the Oda army entered Kyoto, Ashikaga Yoshiaki was inaugurated as the 15th Seitai Shogun, the commander-in-chief of the samurai. The dilapidated imperial palace was repaired by Nobunaga, and the Kubo-sama, the title for the revered shogun, had returned to the capital for the first time in a long while. Yoshiaki took Nobunaga's hand and thanked him with tears. "Nobunaga, you are a truly loyal retainer. From now on, I shall think of you as my father." However, that emotional scene was the peak of their relationship, and, simultaneously, the beginning of the end. At a celebratory banquet, Yoshiaki cheerfully broached a subject to Nobunaga. "In return for this achievement, I intend to grant you the post of Vice Shogun, or Kanrei, shogunal deputy. What do you say?" It was the highest honor for a samurai, the number 2 position in the shogunate. Everyone thought Nobunaga would accept with joy. However, Nobunaga's reaction was cold. He put down his cup and quietly shook his head. "Such titles are unnecessary," the hall buzzed. To refuse the shogun's offer, what disrespect, what selflessness. But Nobunaga's next words froze the air in the room. "Instead, I wish to receive the rights to govern Sakai, Otsu, and Kusatsu." Yoshiaki doubted his ears. What Nobunaga demanded was not an honorable position, but the economic cities that generated, quote, money. Sakai, in particular, was the production center for muskets, and Japan's largest trade port where vast wealth gathered. Nobunaga had no interest in the old framework of authority like the shogunate. He intended to pluck only practical profit and economic power. This wretch. Surely he intends to just use me. A dark stain of suspicion spread within Yoshiaki's heart. That suspicion turned into conviction the following year, when Nobunaga thrust the Denchu Ono Kite regulations for the palace before him. When the shogun sends letters to daimyos in various provinces, he must always obtain Nobunaga's permission. All political decisions of the shogunate must pass through Nobunaga. It was, in effect, a declaration of the shogun's house arrest. "I am not a puppet." Yoshiaki's pride was torn to shreds. The gratitude he once felt for the man he called father flipped into black hatred. While pretending to obey Nobunaga on the surface, Yoshiaki began writing secret letters night after night. "Kill Nobunaga. Save the shogunate." These letters were scattered to powerful warlords across the country. Nobunaga, who had marched on the capital using the authority of the shogun, was now about to be strangled by that very authority. 1570. The first to bear its fangs was the prestigious Asakura Yoshikage of Echizen Province. Nobunaga issued an order to go to the capital under the pretext of quote, 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 greeting the shogun, but the high-born Asakura ignored this. "I cannot bow my head to a lowly upstart like Oda." This refusal became the perfect excuse for Nobunaga. "We will punish the traitor Asakura who defies the shogun's orders." In April, Nobunaga, together with Tokugawa Ieyasu, led a massive army of 30,000 to invade Hieizen. The momentum of the Oda-Tokugawa coalition was tremendous, and Asakura's castles fell one after another. They closed in on the stronghold of Ichijodani, just one step away. No one doubted Oda's overwhelming victory. However, in the midst of that climax, an unbelievable report flew in. Azai Nagamasa of northern Omi has raised an army. He is poised to strike the Oda army from behind. Nobunaga was speechless the moment he heard the report. It is a lie. Nagamasa would not betray me. Azai Nagamasa was his brother-in-law, to whom Nobunaga had married his younger sister Oichi. He was a sworn ally, bound by a solid alliance, whom Nobunaga trusted most. Why, Nagamasa? The face of the good young man Nagamasa floated in Nobunaga's mind. But reality was cruel. For the Azai family, the Isakura family was their former master, to whom they owed a debt of gratitude for generations. Nagamasa chose the old bonds and the anti-Nobunaga voices within his household over his new brother-in-law, Nobunaga. Asakura in front, Azai behind. It was a perfect pincer trap. If they stayed, they would be attacked from both sides and annihilated. Nobunaga realized for the first time in his life the true meaning of defeat. It was a complete checkmate where he could not even make a gamble, like at Okehazama. The decision Nobunaga made here was an unseemly retreat, discarding his pride and everything else. We are fleeing. Pull back from Kanegasaki. Known as the retreat from Kanegasaki, this was the most unseemly and dangerous escape drama in the life of the ruler Nobunaga. Leaving the rear guard, the suicidal role of holding back the enemy, to Kinoshita Tokichiro and Akechi Mitsuhide, Nobunaga ran through the mountains with only a few attendants. Covered in mud, his clothes torn, fleeing back to Kyoto without sleep or rest for days. There was not a speck of the dignity he had during his march to the capital. When he finally reached Kyoto with his life, a boiling anger, more intense than fear, swirled in Nobunaga's heart. Nagamasa Yoshikage, I will make you regret betraying me. Emotion vanished from Nobunaga's face. He had learned a lesson. It is because I showed half-hearted mercy that I was betrayed. Alliances, bonds, love, all are nothing more than fragile glasswork. I will root out those who oppose me. This defeat at Kanegasaki was the final switch that turned Nobunaga into a true demon king. From here, Nobunaga's battles increased in gruesomeness. The burning of Mount Hiei, the annihilation of the Nagashima Iko-Iki rebellions. Against the giant wall of the anti-Nobunaga network, Nobunaga would counter with the flames of terror and massacre. What awaited Nobunaga, who had returned alive from the hell of Kanegasaki, was not rest, but a hopeless reality. The seeds of the Nobunaga encirclement network, scattered by Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki, sprouted all at once. To the north were the traitors Azai Nagamasa and Asakura Yoshikage. To the west, the Mori clan, ruler of the Chugoku region. To the south, the Miyoshi triumvirate. And the most terrifying enemy of all rose up in the land of Osaka. Ishiyama Honganji. It was the headquarters of the Jodo Shinshu sect of Buddhism, a massive religious force possessing armed warrior monks and tens of thousands of devout followers. The chant of Namu Amida Butsu they recited was not a prayer. It was a cursed chanting calling for the death of the enemy of Buddha, Nobunaga. If you advance, you go to paradise. If you retreat, you go to infinite hell. Fearing no death, they were fanatical warriors far more troublesome than samurai. Why? Why do they reject the world I am creating? On the terrace of Gifu Castle, Nobunaga could not hide his irritation. He abolished checkpoints, improved roads, and liberalized commerce with free markets. He destroyed old vested interests and created a system where anyone could become rich through ability. Yet, instead of thanking him, the people abused him as an enemy of Buddha and threw stones at him. Nobunaga's rationality was nothing but terror to the people living in the Middle Ages. They sought the peace of mind, provided by old authorities and religion rather than wealth, a loneliness that is not understood. That loneliness burned up as a cold flame within Nobunaga. If words do not work, I have no choice but to burn them. Unification cannot be achieved through persuasion. A new country can only be built upon ashes. 1571. There was a place located at the center of the encirclement network that served as a hiding place for anti-Nobunaga forces, Enryakuji Temple on Mount Hiei. It was a sacred mountain protecting the Demon's Gate, the unlucky northeast direction of Kyoto, and the highest authority of Japanese Buddhism, with over 700 years of history. When the Azai and Asakura armies were attacked by Nobunaga, they fled into this mountain. They believed that if he touched this, quote, sanctuary, divine punishment would fall upon him. Nobunaga sent a final ultimatum to Mount Hiei. Its content was surprisingly rational. I do not ask you to take our side. Just remain neutral and stop harboring Azai and Asakura. If you comply, I will return all the manors within Oda territory and guarantee the temple's land. The carrot and the stick. This was Nobunaga's final concession. However, the answer that came back from the top of the mountain was silence. No, it was a sneer in the form of silence. The warrior monks were laughing at him. What can that country samurai do? Mount He is the dojo for the protection of the nation. If he sets fire to this place, he will turn every god and Buddha in Japan into his enemy. Resting on their authority, they misjudged Nobunaga's madness. If the gods and Buddhas take the side of Azai and Asakura, all light vanished from Nobunaga's eyes. Then I will burn the gods and Buddhas too. September 12th, Nobunaga gave the order to the entire army. Cut down everyone on the mountain, not just the temple halls and pagodas, but the monks, laymen, women, and children. Leave no one alive. It was an order that made them doubt their ears. My lord, are you sane? There are young children aspiring to learn and high priests on the mountain. If you kill them, the Oda family will be cursed for generations. The retainers tried desperately to stop him. It is said that Akechi Mitsuhide remonstrated with him in tears, but Nobunaga declared expressionlessly, "There is no curse. There are only enemies or allies. That is all." Nobunaga's logic was brutally clear. Those who hold weapons, harbor enemies, and interfere in politics are the same enemies as samurai, even if they wear priestly robes. If they are enemies, destroy them. Gods and Buddhas have nothing to do with it. It was a decision to kill the very era called the Middle Ages. The day of execution. Fire rose from the town of Sakamoto at the foot of Mount He. The flames rode the wind up the slopes, licking up the dense cedar groves. The Kanpon Chudo Hall and the Great Lecture Hall, which had carved out hundreds of years of history, collapsed with crackling sounds. National treasure-class Buddha statues and scriptures fell into ruin. "Yah!" Screams of agony echoed throughout the mountain. The fleeing monks were sniped by Oda's musketeers and skewered by the spear corps. "Help us! We serve the Buddha!" The soldiers lent no ear to the voices begging for their lives, because the eyes of Nobunaga behind them were more terrifying than anyone else. Women and children were also cut down without mercy. The number of dead is said to be in the thousands. The entire mountain turned into a giant crematorium, and its smoke dyed the sky of Kyoto black. The people of Kyoto looked up in the direction of the mountain and trembled. This is not the work of a human. It is the deed of the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. The Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. In Buddhism, this is the strongest devil who resides in the highest heaven of the world of desire and tries to prevent people from achieving enlightenment. It is said that Nobunaga began to call himself this after the burning. It is just what I desire. Only a demon king can pick a fight with gods and Buddhas. By burning Mount Hiei, Nobunaga obtained the ultimate weapon called terror. From this day on, opposing Nobunaga meant death. Asakura, Azai, and Shogun Yoshiaki must have been paralyzed with shock upon hearing the news of the burning. However, ruling people with fear comes with a price. The more feared one becomes, the more true feelings disappear from those around him. My lord, it was magnificent. This is the proof of Tenkafubu. The retainers praised him verbally, but their eyes were not smiling. Akechi Mitsuhide, gazing at the burnt-down temple, may have felt a definitive crack in his heart. How far will this person go? Will I too be burned like that someday? The burning of Mount Hiei. It was also the moment Nobunaga burned the bridge of no return toward national unification. He had become an entity that could no longer be judged by the rules of the human world. However, facing Nobunaga, who had become a demon king, a true, strongest warrior, now stood in his way. The Tiger of Kai, Takeda Shingen. The shadow of the man Nobunaga feared from the bottom of his heart, more than anyone else, was creeping up from the east. Nobunaga had burned Mount Hiei and become a demon king who feared not even God. But the day came when cold sweat ran down Nobunaga's back. A giant black cloud welled up in the eastern sky. The Tiger of Kai, Takeda Shingen, the warlord renowned as the strongest in the warring states, finally raised his heavy body. Shingen was 13 years older than Nobunaga. If Nobunaga was a, quote, revolutionary, Shingen was the perfecter of war. He mastered the art of war by Sun Tzu, solidified the politics of his territory, and the unity of his retainer band was solid as a rock. He was an entity the young Nobunaga admired, modeled himself after, and in the depths of his heart, feared, thinking, I cannot beat this man. That Shingen responded to the call of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki and raised an army for the, quote, subjugation of Nobunaga. October 1572. The Takeda army departing Kofu numbered approximately 30,000. Their march was of a different dimension from enemies up to now. Swift as the wind, quiet as the forest, raiding like fire, immovable as the mountain. Every time the banner of Furinkazan, wind, forest, fire, mountain, waved, the castles along their path surrendered without a fight. Shingen's objective was to crush the provinces of Totomi and Mikawa, the territory of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and then pass through Gifu to march on Kyoto. For Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu was his eastern breakwater. If Ieyasu fell, the Takeda cavalry would jump straight at Nobunaga's throat, unharmed. That meant the destruction of the Oda clan. Lord Nobunaga, reinforcements! Send reinforcements immediately! A desperate cry arrived from Ieyasu. However, Nobunaga could not move. To the west were Azai and Asakura. In Osaka was the Honganji Temple. They had bound Nobunaga's hands and feet. Forgive me, Ieyasu. The only force Nobunaga could send was a mere 3,000 soldiers led by Sakuma Nobumori. Against the Takeda army of 30,000, the Oda Tokugawa coalition numbered a little over 10,000 combined. Moreover, the opponent was the battle-hardened Shingen. Ignoring Ieyasu's residence, Hamamatsu Castle, Shingen leisurely marched west. Damn him, passing me by. I will show him the pride of a samurai. The young Ieyasu, driven by hot blood, abandoned the siege strategy and flew out of the castle. Without knowing, it was Shingen's trap. Mikatagahara. On this flat plateau without a single tree, what awaited Ieyasu was the Takeda army, deployed in a perfect formation. Charge! The moment Shingen waved his war fan, Ieyasu saw hell. The Takeda cavalry unit known as the Red Devils, elite troops dressed entirely in red armor, charged with the force of a raging wave. The impact was like a small boat being swallowed by a tsunami. The Tokugawa army was shattered in a single blow. Soldiers were trampled one after another, and famous loyal retainers died as shields to let Ieyasu escape. "My lord, please flee! As long as you live, we can rebuild." The retainers' screams were drowned out by the Takeda army's victory cry. It is said that Ieyasu, in his terror, lost control of his bowels on horseback while fleeing for his life back to Hamamatsu Castle. The report of this defeat at the Battle of Mikitagahara reached Nobunaga in Gifu immediately. Ieyasu defeated, Tokugawa army in a state of destruction. Nobunaga could not speak for a while after hearing the report. His fingertips were trembling slightly. That tenacious Ieyasu was blown away in just half a day? The strength of the monster, named Takeda Shingen, was far beyond Nobunaga's imagination. Is it over? A vision of his own head exposed before Shingen crossed Nobunaga's mind. The wall called Tokugawa was smashed. Next, it was his turn. If they survived the winter, the Takeda army would undoubtedly flood into Owari and Mino. The current Oda army had no power to stop them. Nobunaga used the weapon of diplomacy. He appealed to the emperor and the shogun, offering a ceasefire to Shingen. "I wish to conclude a peace treaty." It was a plea for his life, discarding all pride. However, the reply from Shingen was hopeless. "My desire is only for the head of the enemy of Buddha, Nobunaga." There had been no room for dialogue from the beginning. The year turned to 1573. For Nobunaga, it was the darkest and coldest new year of his life. The encirclement network was completely finished. Shogun Yoshiaki also raised an army, seizing this opportunity. Nobunaga's fate has run out. Everyone in the world whispered so, and even retainers of the Oda family began calculating their escape. Nobunaga was waiting alone in the depths of Gifu Castle for that time, the time of ruin, or perhaps. However, history had prepared a conclusion that was too dramatic and abrupt. In spring, just as the Takeda army was thought to be finally attacking, a strange movement occurred. The Takeda army, which should have continued its advance, suddenly turned around and began retreating to Kai. What happened? Nobunaga doubted his ears. Information was confused. It seems Shingen has fallen ill. No, perhaps he is dead. Nothing was certain. But there was one thing. For such a huge army to retreat without fighting, there must be a significant reason. Nobunaga looked up at the sky with a prayerful feeling. Has heaven not abandoned me yet? April 12th, at Komaba in Shinshu. The giant star Takeda Shingen quietly closed his life. He was 53. He died leaving the will. Hide my death for 3 years. But the shock was not something that could be hidden. When the report of Shingen's death became certain, it is said that Nobunaga began to laugh like a madman. He died! The old tiger has died! It was a scream of relief from a man who had returned from the brink of death, rather than joy. The strongest wall was removed not by Nobunaga's power, but by the fate of lifespan. However, this did not mean peace would come. Nobunaga decided to use this good fortune to the fullest. Now that Shingen is gone, there is nothing to fear. Nobunaga's counterattack began. The targets were all those who had bared their fangs borrowing Shingen's authority. First, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki, who revolted in Kyoto, and the longtime traitors, Azai and Asakura. I will pay you back double, as if to clear the pent-up anger of the days spent frightened by Shingen's shadow. Nobunaga's rage exploded. It was the beginning of a one-sided purge, rather than a war. 1573. Nobunaga, relieved of the heavy weight of Shingen, rampaged as if a dam had broken. First, he destroyed his longtime archenemies, Asakura Yoshikage and Azai Nagamasa, in succession. In particular, his treatment of his traitorous brother-in-law, Azai Nagamasa, was aberrant. Nobunaga painted the skulls of Nagamasa and his father with gold leaf and displayed them as touch appetizers at the New Year's banquet. Look at the end of traitors. Facing the golden skulls, the retainers trembled, and no one dared to make eye contact. Furthermore, Nobunaga exiled Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiaki from Kyoto. With this, the Muromachi shogunate, which had lasted for 240 years, met its de facto end. He burned gods and Buddhas, crushed noble families, and discarded the shogun. Nobunaga was about to hold Tenka, the realm, in his hands in both name and reality. However, the nightmare was not over. The Takeda that was supposed to be dead began to move again. The son who succeeded Shingen, Takeda Katsuyori. Perhaps from a complex of having a great father, he was more warlike and ferocious than his father. Even if Lord Shingen is dead, Takeda is not weak. As if to prove that, Katsuyori resumed the invasion of Tokugawa territory. May 1575. A massive army of 15,000, led by Takeda Katsuyori, surrounded Nagashino Castle in the hinterlands of Mikawa. The defender of the castle was a young warrior on the Tokugawa side, Okudaira Nobumasa. His troop strength was a mere 500. Surrounded by 30 times the enemy, the castle was completely isolated. Provisions were running out, and the fall of the castle was a matter of time. Is there anyone who can request reinforcements from Lord Ieyasu in Okazaki? The one who responded to the castle lord's call was a single asterisk Ashigaru, foot soldier, named Tori Tsunemon. He was by no means a high-ranking samurai. He was clumsy and unimpressive in appearance, but his loyalty was thicker than anyone else's. I shall go. Tsunemon slipped out of the castle under the cover of darkness, swam down the cold river, and broke through the Takeda army's strict encirclement. Then he ran through 65 kilometers of mountain roads without sleep or rest, reaching Okazaki Castle, where Ieyasu and Nobunaga were. My lords, please save Nagashino. Seeing Tsunemon prostrating himself in his tattered state, Nobunaga was also moved. Rest assured, Nobunaga himself will head there with a large army. Having secured the promise of reinforcements, Tsunemon immediately turned back. He wanted to tell his comrades in the castle as soon as possible that help is coming. However, right in front of the castle, he was unfortunately captured by the Takeda army. Takeda Katsuyori offered Tsunemon a deal. Shout toward the castle that, "Reinforcements are not coming, surrender. If you do, I will spare your life and treat you well as a retainer of the Takeda clan." Tsunemon answered, "I understand," and was dragged out to the opposite bank, visible from the castle. Crucified, he faced the castle soldiers who wore expressions of despair. Tsunemon took a deep breath and shouted, "Reinforcements are coming! Lord Nobunaga's great army is almost there! Hold out until then!" It was the scream of a soul that broke a promise and chose its own death. Enraged, the Takeda soldiers stabbed Tsunemon to death with spears on the spot. But his death was not in vain. Hearing those words, the soldiers of Nagashino Castle shed tears and were roused to action. Tsunemon threw away his life to tell us, "Defend the castle, even if we die." The morale of the castle rose explosively, repelling every fierce attack by the Takeda army. "Damn it, mere common soldiers." Takeda Katsuyori panicked. Then further bad news arrived. Oda Tokugawa coalition army has arrived. Their number is approximately 38,000. To the west of Nagashino Castle, at Shitaragahara, Nobunaga's massive army appeared. Against 15,000 Takeda troops, the Oda Tokugawa army had 38,000. Oda had an overwhelming numerical advantage. In a normal battle, Takeda should have retreated here. However, Katsuyori did not pull back. Since the time of my father, Lord Shingen, the Takeda cavalry has been invincible. We will scatter the Oda army, which only has numbers. He had absolute confidence in the strongest cavalry corps, and more than anything, the pride that "I cannot surpass my father if I run here" distorted his judgment. Katsuyori left a part of the siege on Nagashino Castle, and turned his main force toward Shitaragahara. Meanwhile, as soon as he arrived at Shitaragahara, Nobunaga issued a strange order. Build horse guard fences. The soldiers began cutting trees from nearby mountains and building wooden fences that continued endlessly along the river. It was less a position for open field battle and more like a giant cage. Behind this fence, Nobunaga had them line up a certain weapon muskets. The number was 3,000. Even in Japan at that time, or globally, there was no example of gathering such a number of guns on a single battlefield. Nobunaga had bought up every available musket from Sakai and Kunitomo village in Omi. Their retainers were bewildered. "My lord, muskets cannot be used if it rains. Besides, it takes too much time to load the bullets." A matchlock gun of that time took from 30 seconds to nearly a minute to fire the next shot after firing once. In that gap, if the Takeda cavalry charged, it would be the end. But Nobunaga laughed coldly. "That is why we build fences, and with 3,000 guns, the barrage will not be broken." He intended to operate muskets not as tools to assist individual bravery, but as a, quote, factory system to process the enemy. Night of May 20th. It rained at Shitaragahara. In the Takeda camp, veteran generals advised Katsuyori to retreat. "It is rain. Muskets cannot be used tomorrow, but the ground will loosen and slow the horses." Feet. The Oda formation is strange. There must be some trap. But Katsuyori did not listen. "The rain will stop. The Oda are just cowards hiding behind fences blown by the wind of fear. Trample them down, fence and all." The next morning, May 21st, the rain stopped and the mist cleared. The rising sun illuminated the gentle hills of Shitaragahara. To the east, the Red Devils and the rest of the Takeda's strongest cavalry corps. To the west, the Oda musketeers lined up in order behind the horse guard fences. It was the opening of a historic moment where medieval chivalry and modern firepower warfare collided head-on. Nobunaga sat on his folding stool, quietly surveying the battlefield. He could see it. What was about to happen was not a heroic battle. It was a one-sided, merciless slaughter. "Charge!" With Takeda Katsuyori's command, the sound of hooves shaking the earth roared. The strongest cavalry corps began their assault toward Nobunaga's fence. The ground rumble grew closer. The Takeda cavalry closed in 200 meters, then 100 meters to the fence. Their intensity was truly like a moving castle wall. An ordinary foot soldier would drop his spear in terror and flee. But the Oda soldiers did not move. They believed in the iron tubes in their hands and in Nobunaga behind them. "Not yet. Do not fire yet." The field commanders restrained the trembling soldiers. The distance where they could see the enemies, faces, hear the horses, heavy breathing. 50 meters. At that critical moment, the war fan Nobunaga had raised was swung down. Fire! A roar. It was not the sound of a single gunshot. It was the explosion of 1,000 muskets spewing fire simultaneously. White smoke covered their vision, and an ear-splitting shockwave ran through the air. Immediately after, the mounted warriors running at the front of the Takeda line were blown away one after another, as if struck by an invisible giant hand. Horses neighed. Riders flew through the air and were slammed onto the ground. The following cavalry stumbled over their fallen allies, toppling like dominoes. But the terror of the Takeda army started here. "Do not flinch! Climb over them!" The second and third waves climbed over the mounds of corpses and charged. Muskets take time to reload. If we strike in that gap, we can win. They believed this. However, that hope was mercilessly shattered. As soon as the first rank finished firing, they quickly stepped back. In their place, the second rank, who had already finished loading their bullets, stepped forward. "Fire!" A second roar. Then the third rank, an uninterrupted barrage of death. The system of three-stage volley, rotating lines to maintain continuous fire, devised by Nobunaga, overturned the common sense of the battlefield. It was no longer a battle. It was unilateral processing. The fierce warriors of Takeda, known as the strongest in the warring states, were turned into mere lumps of meat without even being able to swing their swords. Yamagata Masakage, Baba Nobuharu, Naito Masatoyo. The legendary generals who had supported the Takeda clan since the era of Lord Shingen swiftly lost their lives to lead bullets fired by nameless foot soldiers. No, this is absurd. Takeda Katsuyori, watching the war situation from the main camp, was stunned. The invincible cavalry was melting away without laying a finger on the fence. Courage, pride, training, were they all meaningless before new technology? The field of Nagashino was filled with an immense number of human and horse corpses, and the flowing river was dyed bright red with blood. Past 2 p.m., the Takeda army was annihilated. Katsuyori fled in tears with only a few attendants. It was a complete victory for the Oda Tokugawa army. However, on the battlefield, filled with the smell of gunpowder smoke, there were no cheers from the victors. There was only ringing in their ears and nausea at the scene, which was far too gruesome. Nobunaga stepped out from behind the fence and looked down at the mountain of corpses. He nodded with satisfaction. This is it. This is the new war. The era of relying on individual bravery was over. Money, numbers, and technology. Only those who rationally combined these would take the realm. At this moment, Nobunaga transformed into an entity that no one could stop. The victory at Nagashino shocked all of Japan. You cannot beat the Oda. Is Nobunaga a god of war or a devil? Opposing forces were terrified and lost the will to resist. Obstacles vanished from before Nobunaga. And in 1576, to give form to his peak, Nobunaga began building a gigantic castle on the shores of Lake Biwa. Azuchi Castle. It was fundamentally different from the castles for fighting up to that point. It was a castle for showing. The entire 199-meter Mount Azuchi was fortified, and towering at its summit was Japan's first high-rise architecture called Tenshu. 5 layers, 7 floors. The top floor was covered in gold leaf, and below it was a vermilion octagonal hall. Its figure shining in the sunlight was like the Buddhist paradise descended to earth. I am the master of heaven. Nobunaga named this keep Tenshu, using characters that meant Lord of Heaven, instead of the traditional tower protector. It was a statement that he would become the god of this country, transcending even the emperor. The interior was decorated with gorgeous wall paintings by the master artist Kano Eitoku, and countless lanterns were lit at night. People seeing that light from the opposite shore of the lake are said to have clasped their hands in prayer at its beauty and terror. At Azuchi Castle, Nobunaga established a new style of governance. It was *Chinoyu, the tea ceremony. Nobunaga employed tea masters like Sen no Rikyu and used the way of tea as a political tool. He gave a value equivalent to a whole province to a single tea bowl called a meibutsu, masterpiece, and granted them to retainers as rewards. Territory is finite, but value can be created infinitely. Nobunaga placed even economy and culture under his control. However, behind that glamorous stage, the distance between Nobunaga and his retainers grew decisively apart. There was no longer the bond of comrades in arms like before. There was only the relationship between an absolute monarch and slaves frightened of him. Nobunaga mercilessly cut off anyone he judged incompetent, even if they were meritorious retainers from long ago. A symbolic incident occurred, the banishment of Sukuma Nobumori, the head retainer of the Oda clan. Nobumori was the most senior heavy retainer who had served since Nobunaga's father's time and was known as an expert in retreat battles. However, Nobunaga thrust a letter of reprimand extending to 19 articles at him. You have achieved nothing in these past 5 years. You are greedy, do not cherish your subordinates, and merely sit back arrogantly on the tatami. Go to Mount Koya. Nobunaga confiscated all of Nobumori's territory and assets, banishing him practically naked. This incident sent a shockwave through the Oda household. If even Lord Sakuma can be discarded when he is no longer useful, heavy retainers like Akechi Mitsuhide and Hashiba Hideyoshi trembled. Is it my turn tomorrow? In the Tenshu of Azuchi, Nobunaga tilted his glass in solitude while looking down at the lower world. Around him were only yes-men. There was no longer anyone who would admonish him honestly, or a friend who could talk to him as an equal. Can no one keep up with my speed? The ruler possessed by beauty and terror. The brighter his radiance became, the darker, longer and blacker the shadow stretching at his feet grew. The wind of foreign lands also blew in Azuchi Castle. Nobunaga welcomed missionaries who came from Europe. It is said that Nobunaga's eyes shone like a child's at the globe, clock, and stories of black ships they brought. Is the world round? Then, after I flatten Japan, I will cross the sea and take on the world. His ideas had already transcended the frame of an island nation's king. However, the more Nobunaga's gaze turned toward the distant world, the more the emotional distance from the retainers at his feet widened to a hopeless degree. We ordinary people cannot understand what the Lord is thinking. The enthusiasm that once supported Nobunaga vanished, replaced only by the fear of who will be banished next. While Nobunaga spun the globe in the Azuchi Keep, retainers held their breath in the corridors, gauging each other's expressions. 1582. Nobunaga's path to hegemony was entering its final stage, the decisive battle with the Mori clan, the massive power controlling the western half of Japan. Nobunaga entrusted this harsh mission to the man with the sharpest wits, Hashiba Hideyoshi. Monkey, carve out the Chugoku region and bring it to me as a souvenir. Hideyoshi fought desperately to answer Nobunaga's expectations, starving Tottori Castle, flooding Takamatsu Castle. He used wisdom and money like water to corner the Mori. But the Mori were also desperate. They resisted with the total power of their home provinces, and the battle lines fell into a stalemate. My lord, the enemy's power is too great. Please, send reinforcements. A scream-like request from Hideyoshi reached Azuchi Castle. Nobunaga spread out a map and made a decision. All right, this is the finishing touch. I will march out myself. He would lead a large army personally to crush the Mori. And as his vanguard, he decided to send the sharpest mind to manage the Kinki region, Akechi Mitsuhide. This personnel appointment would become the final trigger that drove the Oda clan's fate mad. I must speak a little about the man named Akechi Mitsuhide. He was the exact opposite of Nobunaga in character. A man of common sense who was polite, deeply cultured, and valued good old traditions. That is exactly why he perfectly cleaned up after the unconventional Nobunaga and became the top achiever. However, his inner heart had reached its limit from years of stress. You worked hard. When he had pacified the province of Tanbo with great trouble, Mitsuhide thought Nobunaga would praise him with those words. But what Nobunaga showered him with was not praise, but violence. What did someone like you actually do? The humiliation of being beaten in front of everyone and having his head rubbed against the floor. For Nobunaga, it was natural for subordinates to work. Use them if they produce results, discard them if they don't. That dry rationality scraped away the serious Mitsuhide's pride, little by little, but surely. And the fateful month of May arrived. A reception was held at Azuchi Castle to invite his longtime ally, Tokugawa Ieyasu. The one ordered to be the reception official was Mitsuhide. Lord Ieyasu is an important guest. Do not fail. Mitsuhide prepared, sparing no time even for sleep. The finest ingredients, refined vessels, perfect etiquette. However, in the middle of the banquet, Nobunaga's expression changed, and he sniffed the air. "The fish is rotten." Nobunaga's low voice froze the air in the hall. "No, such a thing cannot be." The moment Mitsuhide tried to explain, Nobunaga kicked the serving tray. "Do you dare talk back? Do you intend to treat Lord Ieyasu with such rotten fish?" Crash! The dishes shattered, and the soup stained Mitsuhide's clothes. "I have no excuse." Mitsuhide slammed his forehead on the floor and apologized. But Nobunaga's anger did not subside. "You are finished. I relieve you of your duty as reception official. Return to your castle immediately, prepare yourself, and go reinforce Hideyoshi." It was not a simple transfer. It was a de facto order to swap provinces, taking away the territories of Sakamoto and Tamba that Mitsuhide had built up over many years and telling him, "Seize the enemy's territory and make that your new country." Mitsuhide withdrew with a pale face. Walking down the corridor, his back looked as if something definitive had snapped. Humiliation, exhaustion, and despair for the future. "If this continues, I will be killed," either exiled like Sakuma Nobumori, or cut down for an unreasonable reason. Serving a lord like Nobunaga was like walking on thin ice. Mitsuhide returned to his residence, Kameyama Castle. Soldiers were preparing for departure, but the general, Mitsuhide, remained silent, alone in the inner room. It is said that he climbed Mount Otago and drew fortune slips repeatedly. Bad luck, great bad luck. Even the gods and Buddhas were issuing warnings about his future. At a Ringa linked verse gathering, Mitsuhide composed a stanza. "The time is now. The rain falls beneath the sky of May." Toki, time, refers to himself, descending from the Toki clan. Rain falls beneath the sky. Ame ga shita shiru can be interpreted as ruling the realm under the heavens. Ten ga shita shiru. This was not a mere poem. It was a declaration of determination for treason that had risen to his throat. On the other hand, Nobunaga in Azuchi Castle had no way of knowing Mitsuhide's anguish. He was preparing to head to Kyoto in high spirits. If Mitsuhide and Hideyoshi join forces, the Mori are no enemy. With this, the realm will be settled. Nobunaga went up to the capital with only a small force and entered Honnoji Temple. He intended to hold a tea gathering, admire famous tea utensils, and enjoy a long-awaited rest. There are no enemies. Yes, Nobunaga was convinced. The threat from the north was gone, Ieyasu in the east was an ally, and he was about to crush the Mori in the west. His surroundings should have been completely pacified. However, he had forgotten. The most dangerous enemy is not across the border. He lurks within the heart of the most excellent, quietest man to whom you have entrusted your back. June 1st, an army of 13,000 led by Akechi Mitsuhide departed Kameyama Castle. Their destination should have been the Chugoku region in the west. However, in the middle of the march, Mitsuhide turned his horse's head to the east. The soldiers buzzed. "My lord, the road is wrong. Are we heading to Kyoto?" In the moonlight, Mitsuhide quietly raised his whip. "My enemy is at Honnoji." Those words threw the gears of history wildly out of order. The colossal empire Nobunaga had built. The countdown to its collapse began quietly, but with certainty. June 2nd, 1582, 4 a.m. The capital of Kyoto was still deep in darkness and silence. In his sleeping quarters at Honnoji Temple, Nobunaga suddenly woke up. He felt a faint tremor rising from the bottom of the earth in the distance. Was it the sound of wind, or perhaps thunder? No. It was the rhythmic sound of thousands of military boots. A quarrel? Nobunaga initially thought the lower-ranking servants were making noise. There could not possibly be anyone who would turn a blade against him, the ruler of the realm, right in the middle of Kyoto. That carelessness may have been the final humanity the Demon King harbored. However, that perception was shattered by a single gunshot piercing through the sliding door. Bang! A dry, cracking sound tore through the silence. "My lord! It is treason!" His page, Mori Ranmaru, rushed in with a pale face. "The enemy has completely surrounded us on all four sides. Their number is approximately 10,000. 10,000. Against this, the defense force of Honnoji was less than 100. Nobunaga stood up in his sleeping robes and questioned sharply, "What is the banner?" Ranmaru's lips trembled. "Light blue. It appears to be the crest of the light blue bellflower. The army of Lord Akechi, governor of Hyuga." Time stopped. The face of that serious man, more loyal than anyone else, floated in Nobunaga's mind. The man he had oppressed, beaten, and cornered. "Mitsuhide, is it?" What leaked from Nobunaga's lips was neither anger nor sadness. It was a sound of acceptance that oddly made sense. According to the logic of power and terror he himself had created, it is the natural providence for a weakened lord to be devoured by the strong. Mitsuhide had come to devour Nobunaga, exactly as Nobunaga had taught him. There is no help for it. It cannot be helped. Murmuring this shortly, Nobunaga took his bow and ran out into the corridor. "Women, flee! Men, follow me!" Akechi's soldiers were already flooding into the garden. Nobunaga loosed arrows at the approaching soldiers. Whoosh! A single arrow, accurate beyond compare, pierced the throat of the lead soldier. "The Lord is using a bow himself. Do not flinch. There are only a few of them." Akechi's soldiers rushed in. Nobunaga knocked and fired arrows one after another, until the string snapped, and the bow became useless. Switching his weapon to a spear, he charged forward. His figure had returned from being the ruler governing the realm to a single fighting beast. However, he was heavily outnumbered. Countless spears aimed at Nobunaga's body. A sharp pain ran through his left elbow. Fresh blood sprayed from the wound stabbed by a spear. "Ugh!" Nobunaga knelt, using the spear as a cane. His vision wavered. His attendants, including Ranmaru, were killed in action one by one. Is this the end? Glaring at the enemy soldiers, Nobunaga retreated to the storage room in the back. "I will not hand over my head. I will let no one touch it." He forced the court ladies to escape, then locked the storage room from the inside. Then he poured oil on a nearby cloth and set it on fire. Whoosh! The flames flared up. The flames licked the sliding doors in the blink of an eye, scorched the pillars, and crept up to the ceiling. Heat and smoke burned Nobunaga's lungs. In his fading consciousness, Nobunaga saw a revolving lantern of memories, his boyhood days rebelling against his father, the rain at Okehazama, the mountains of Mino, the radiance of Azuchi. Everything was like a dream and an illusion. He no longer had the strength to dance Atsumori. In the center of the raging flames, Nobunaga quietly sat cross-legged. He thrust a short sword into his belly. There was no pain. There was only a massive amount of heat and a strange silence. Mitsuhide, make the realm interesting. That murmur was buried under the ceiling, collapsing with a roar and vanished forever. Around 8 a.m., Honnoji Temple burned to the ground. Akechi Mitsuhide frantically ordered a search for Nobunaga's body. "If we do not have his head, we cannot prove anything to the realm." They sifted through the ash and moved the rubble, but Nobunaga's body was never found. As if he were an illusion that never existed in this world from the beginning, Nobunaga had turned into smoke and vanished into the sky. Nobunaga is dead. That shocking news raced through Japan via express messengers. The sound of the realm falling. it was not the beginning of the end. With the removal of the giant weight called Nobunaga, the era began to rotate violently once again. There was a man who heard that sound faster than anyone and made his move. Hashiba Hideyoshi, who was in Bichu Takamatsu in the western provinces. The Lord was killed? Hideyoshi collapsed in tears the moment he heard the report. However, faster than his tears could dry, his eyes harbored a sharp light. This is an opportunity. If I avenge Nobunaga, I can become his successor. Hideyoshi concluded a peace treaty with the Mori he was fighting with lightning speed and turned his entire army around. This is known as the Great Chugoku U-turn. On the other hand, the realm for Mitsuhide was far too short. I quote, 3-day reign. Before the miraculous speed of Hideyoshi's advance, Mitsuhide was defeated at the Battle of Yamazaki without time to prepare. It was only 11 days after the Honnoji incident. The man who killed Nobunaga was also swallowed by the muddy torrent of the era. A world without Nobunaga began from the ruins. However, what Nobunaga left behind was not just ash. The door of the Middle Ages he destroyed, the economic system he arranged, and the clear vision of national unification. These were passed on to Hideyoshi and then to Ieyasu, eventually connecting to the 260 years of the peaceful Edo period. Nobunaga's death began to swallow everything around it like a giant black hole. Within the very day Honnoji turned to ash, the city of Kyoto fell into panic. Lord Nobunaga is dead. Who will take the realm next? Bandits and mobs overflowed and public order collapsed. The lid of the warring states that Nobunaga had held down by force had opened again. The wave of chaos also surged toward Azuchi Castle, the crystallization of Nobunaga's dream. Having lost their master, maids and soldiers fled from the castle, scattering like baby spiders. Then, a fire of unknown origin broke out, about half a month after the Honnoji incident. That gorgeous and resplendent Asterisk Tenshu keep, towering on the shores of Lake Biwa, was wrapped in crimson flames. Did Mitsuhide set the fire? Was it the work of looters? Or did the Oda family members burn it themselves, realizing their defeat? The truth remains a mystery, but one thing is certain. The symbol of the god's country Nobunaga aimed for vanished from the earth forever, as if chasing after its lord. The Golden Castle became a dream and illusion in just 3 years. Meanwhile, reality was cruel for Akechi Mitsuhide, who killed Nobunaga, he believed. If I kill the tyrant Nobunaga, the public should support me. The warlords who love the good old order should take my side. He wrote letters to the imperial court and various daimyo seeking cooperation. He placed great expectations, especially on his close friend Hosokawa Fujitaka and Tsutsui Junkei. However, the reply was silence. No one took Mitsuhide's side. Why? They knew the strength of the system that the man named Nobunaga had built, and what a dangerous gamble it was to kill one's lord. Mitsuhide trembled in the fear of being isolated and helpless at the imperial palace in Kyoto. All he obtained was not the realm, but only the lonely label of traitor. Into that gap returned Hashiba Hideyoshi with furious momentum, the Great Chugoku U-turn. This march, covering a distance of 200 kilometers in just a few days, is said to be a military miracle. It is said the soldiers bit into rice balls while running, sparing no time even to eat. Why could they do that? Because Nobunaga had possessed Hideyoshi. This is a battle of mourning. Hideyoshi shouted so, but deep in his eyes lay a cold calculation inherited from Nobunaga. The one who kills Mitsuhide faster than anyone else will become the next Nobunaga. Speed is life. Rationality is justice. Hideyoshi perfectly executed the teachings as the disciple who learned the most from Nobunaga. Hideyoshi, who defeated Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, went on to unify the realm as Nobunaga's successor. And after that, Tokugawa Ieyasu completed the peaceful world. They built a house on the foundation Nobunaga had made. Nobunaga was a destroyer, thoroughly destroying the old building called the Middle Ages to make it a vacant lot. That was a dirty and cruel job that only he could do. If Nobunaga had lived, what would Japan have become afterwards? He might have abolished the emperor, sent troops overseas, and created a world empire. But at the same time, endless purges and terror might have continued. There are no ifs in history, but one thing can be said. Nobunaga died because he was destined to die at that time. Perhaps the era removed him because he had finished his role of destruction. Oda Nobunaga died at 49. A verse from Atsumori he liked. Human life lasts only 50 years. He fell short by 1 year. However, those 49 years were a time far denser, more intense, and hotter than several hundred years lived by ordinary humans. He appeared like lightning, twisted the shape of the country of Japan, and left like a storm. The modern society we live in now. Evaluation based on ability regardless of status. Separation of religion and politics. Turning the economy to enrich the country. All of these are seeds Nobunaga sowed and raised with blood and fire. Without knowing it, we are living in the world Nobunaga created. When standing on the site of Honnoji Temple, one can still hear the sound of the wind. Is it the lament of a man whose dream of unifying the realm was shattered? No, surely not. It is the loud laughter of that man who laughed off old common sense and raced through to a new era. There is no help for it. The dream of the Demon King, who murmured so and vanished into the flames, may still be burning somewhere in this country. The story ends here, but history continues. Has the spark called Nobunaga remained in your heart? May that fire become a small heat for you to live tomorrow. We will bring this long tale of battles to a close. Thank you very much for listening until the end.